You are standing in the wreckage of your own existence, surrounded by the shattered, smoking remnants of a reality you spent years meticulously constructing. Every single pillar of security that used to anchor your mornings, the professional titles that fed your ego, the financial reserves that guarded your family, and the social validations you mistook for absolute loyalty have vanished into thin air in a single catastrophic afternoon. The baseline infrastructure of your daily life is completely gone. The average man, when confronted with this sudden, unvarnished vacuum, automatically plunges into an acute state of existential panic. He allows his mind to flood with bitterness, paces his room in circles, screams at an indifferent sky, and frantically reaches backward into the past, begging for a timeline that no longer exists. He views the collapse of his life as an unprovoked insult from fate, a definitive end to his story, and a permanent sentence to absolute mediocrity. But you must force yourself to look at this wreckage with a cold, clinical, and completely detached perspective. What if this structural collapse is not the tragic conclusion of your journey, but the absolute mandatory intervention your soul required? What if the total destruction of your comfortable cage is the exact industrial forge required to melt down your fragile defaults and shape you into an untouchable sovereign entity from scratch? The fire does not destroy the granite, it burns away the cheap debris to expose the true fortress beneath. When everything is brutally stripped from your hands, you do not lose your power. You discover the raw, terrifying architecture of authentic freedom. In the modern landscape, you are constantly conditioned to define your human worth by the heavy accumulation of outside vanity, chasing corporate titles, leasing luxury assets, and curating an illusion of prosperity for a public gallery that is not even paying attention. You do not own these objects. These objects actively own your mind. They turn your consciousness into a fragile hostage, forcing you to operate in a state of continuous anxiety because you are constantly terrified of losing the decorations that define your false identity. The moment fate strips these items away, the leverage the world held over your nervous system drops to absolute zero. You are liberated from the exhausting performance of a life you did not choose, freed from the suffocating obligations of maintaining shallow social alignments, and permanently rescued from the soft, air-conditioned comforts that were quietly eroding your raw potential. The master Stoic recognizes that wealth, status, praise, and comfort were never his permanent property. They were merely temporary variables on loan from the vault of fortune, and fortune reserves the absolute right to reclaim her assets at any given second without your permission or an apology. Standing in the absolute center of your ruins, you must completely silence the emotional tantrum of your ego and ask your soul a single, diagnostic question: what remains? When the bank accounts are frozen, when the titles are stripped, when the fake friends have vanished into the fog, and when the physical arena around you is completely burning, you are forced to look at the unvarnished substrate of your existence. What remains is the single asset that the external universe cannot touch, manipulate, or draw blood from unless you willingly open the gates and surrender it. What remains is your character, the structural integrity of your rational mind, and your unyielding ability to choose your next internal perspective. The crowd believes you have been ruined because your exterior walls have crumbled, completely blind to the reality that the inhabitant inside the fortress is still entirely unharmed. You are not your debt. You are not your failed business venture. You are not your broken relationship. And you are not the opinions of the spectators waiting for you to quit. You are the consciousness that observes the disaster, evaluates the damage, and retains total custody over its own movements. True reconstruction never initiates with a frantic attempt to repair your external environment or piece together the broken fragments of your physical routine. It begins with a violent internal recategorization of how you perceive the crisis itself. You must take a hard, unblinking look at the wreckage of your current reality, whether it manifests as overwhelming financial debt, the sudden betrayal of a trusted partner, or the total collapse of a long-term professional roadmap, and separate the data from the drama. You must ruthlessly divide every single element of the disaster into two absolute buckets: the things that rest within your direct power to control, and the things that lie entirely outside your borders. The hard, unvarnished truth that your childish ego refuses to swallow is that you control almost nothing in the external universe. You do not control the sudden macroeconomic shifts of the market. You do not control the micro-expressions and deceptive behaviors of other human beings, and you do not control the massive structural odds that fate has stacked against your current position. When you continue to invest your limited morning cognitive capital into wishing the market hadn't crashed, or obsessing over why someone treated your devotion like an option, you are actively committing spiritual suicide, handing the remote control of your nervous system to volatile, indifferent forces. To truly master the psychology of the rubble, you must examine the profound evolutionary trap of nostalgia. When a sudden catastrophe shatters your baseline environment, your primitive survival wiring automatically defaults to an idealized memory of what used to be. You remember the old revenue metrics, the comfort of the old relationship, or the ease of your previous social status, completely airbrushing out the structural friction and stagnation that were actually rotting your potential from within. You turn the past into a golden sanctuary, which effectively paralyzes your current execution. A sovereign man understands that nostalgia is a highly sophisticated form of mental cowardice. It is the ego's desperate strategy to run away from the raw, unpolished manual labor required to clear the debris right in front of your face today. The past is a dead graveyard of data points. It has zero physical components, zero mechanical moving parts, and zero operational utility on your current laboratory floor. Every single second you spend looking backward wishing the architecture hadn't collapsed is a unit of cognitive force you have actively stolen from the foundation of your future empire. You must look at the wreckage not with a sense of tragic loss, but with the cold, calculating eye of a salvage engineer, identifying exactly what raw material can be recycled to fortify your next citadel. Consider the historical reality of Clinthus, a box fighter who arrived in ancient Athens with absolutely nothing to his name but a massive frame and an unyielding will to study philosophy. He did not possess wealthy patrons, inherited estates, or convenient shortcuts to status. To survive, he spent his entire nights hauling heavy water buckets for local gardeners, working in absolute darkness under grueling physical strain, just so he could spend his daytime hours sitting at the feet of the Stoic masters, absorbing the rigid blueprints of internal mastery. The public gallery looked at his manual labor with pity and condescension, viewing him as a simple beast of burden trapped at the absolute bottom of the social ladder. They were completely blind to the reality that the heavy water buckets were the exact physical forge hardening his discipline metrics into pure diamond. He did not complain about his exhaustion, he did not beg the universe for an easier schedule, and he absolutely did not adjust his principles to win the cheap validation of spectators. When he eventually succeeded Zeno as the leader of the Stoic school, he did so as an unshakable rock because his internal architecture had been engineered in the dark trenches of absolute hardship. Look closely at the hidden structural danger of prolonged comfort and unchallenged prosperity. When your routine is smooth, when the metrics are consistently positive, and when the external environment caters to your every desire, your internal defenses naturally undergo total degradation. You stop monitoring your perimeter walls, you tolerate small discipline leaks in your morning schedule, and you slowly allow your software to become lazy and reactive. Prosperity hides your psychological flaws under a counterfeit layer of security. Adversity, therefore, acts as a violent but necessary diagnostic calibration. The collapse of your external framework forces every single hidden weakness, every hidden dependency, and every fracture line in your character to immediately rise to the surface. It shows you exactly where your armor is thin, where you have been relying on outside applause to sustain your ego, and where you are still fragile. You should welcome the disaster as a supreme piece of clinical audit data. It allows you to see the absolute bottom of your operational capability, giving you the precise coordinates required to rebuild your perimeter with double the thickness of your old layout. Analyze the deep cognitive mechanics of what can only be defined as environmental fasting. When you are suddenly forced into a season of material scarcity, social isolation, or professional demotion, your brain automatically interprets the removal of simulation as an acute emergency scenario. It screams for you to replace the lost items immediately, driving you to chase low-value connections, cheap validation loops, or frantic shortcuts just to patch the hole in your exterior image. You must forcefully override this primitive panic layer. Treat the vacuum not as a crisis of lack, but as a deliberate period of structural fasting for your soul. Just as physical fasting purges the biological system of toxic accumulations and resets your metabolic baseline, environmental fasting completely strips away the superficial dependencies that were crowding your internal focus. You learn to live without the constant noise of the public gallery. You learn to operate your machinery without the luxury fuels of cheap praise. And you figure out how to maintain an ironclad posture when you are completely alone in the dark. This clean baseline transforms you into a terrifyingly efficient producer. The absolute cornerstone of your reconstruction blueprint relies on the uncompromising elimination of the public declaration trap. When an amateur experiences a major personal or professional setback, his immediate defensive instinct is to run straight to the digital square to broadcast his new goals, his upcoming projects, or his intense commitment to a comeback. He is using cheap verbal promises to manufacture a counterfeit injection of social validation, trying to convince the crowd that he is still relevant and powerful. This is a catastrophic leak of your creative force. The energy you spend explaining your strategy to spectators is energy you have permanently stolen from the actual execution of the labor. A master Stoic builds his empire in absolute suffocating silence. He does not post his metrics, he does not announce his boundaries, and he offers zero context to casual observers who notice his sudden unavailability. He drops behind locked doors, dissolves entirely from the social grid, and lets his physical results do every single unit of the talking for him. When you stop feeding the crowd's curiosity, you store a massive reservoir of internal tension that directly drives your machine through the heaviest periods of friction. Let us now systematically break down the mechanics of the transition zone, the treacherous psychological gray area that exists between the moment the rubble settles and the moment your new habits begin to yield actual visible metrics. This is the timeline where 90% of individuals completely fail. When you begin writing clean code, logging long hours on your enterprise, or training your body in complete isolation, your primitive neural network expects immediate external feedback. It wants the views to skyrocket, it wants the bank account to swell, and it wants the critics to send messages of immediate apology. But fate does not operate on your shallow microwave timeline. The algorithm of reality requires a heavy period of unrewarded execution. You must learn to develop a state of clinical sensory deprivation regarding short-term feedback. If you check your dashboard every 20 minutes, hoping for a sign of validation, you are showing the universe that your discipline is still a fragile performance, dependent on outside weather. A sovereign man measures his victory exclusively by the total volume of silent labor he completed before the sun went down. Examine the immense law of architectural threshold. When you set out to build a structure of immense proportion, you do not initiate the project by setting elegant bricks above the surface line. You spend weeks, months, and enormous blocks of physical capital digging deep into the pitch-black subterranean earth, carving a massive cavity into the absolute hardest bedrock layers of granite. To the casual observer walking past the construction site perimeter, it looks as though nothing is being produced. It looks like a massive, empty, unproductive pit of mud and rubble. The spectator laughs because he cannot see the heavy concrete and reinforced iron frames being sunk deep beneath the baseline of the earth. But when the winter storms hit, when the global markets shift, and when the heavy structural pressures of reality lean against the eventual skyscraper, it stands completely immovable because its hidden subterranean foundation matches the exact density of the mountain itself. You must treat your current season of total isolation and zero external views exactly like the subterranean digging phase of your citadel. You are not losing your time. You are burying your roots deep inside the stone where no outside storm can ever reach them. Unpack the profound physical law of kinetic tension accumulation. When an expert archer prepares to launch a high-velocity payload across a massive battlefield distance, he does not simply pick up the arrow and push it forward with a soft, casual movement of his hand. He places the notch against a rigid, unbending wooden frame, locks his stance completely firm into the dirt, and pulls the heavy cord backward with an intense expenditure of physical strain. The farther backward the arrow is dragged, the higher the structural pressure rises across the frame, and the more uncomfortable the mechanical compression becomes within his upper back muscles. The amateur looks at the arrow moving backward away from the target line and foolishly assumes that progress has been completely reversed. He doesn't understand that this precise backward retreat is the mandatory engineering path required to accumulate an explosive, unstoppable store of kinetic energy. The moment the archer opens his fingers and releases his grip, the accumulated tension snaps forward with terrifying velocity, driving the steel tip straight through the thickest armor plating on the horizon. Your current setback is simply the long, silent backward drag of the bowstring. Consider the baseline psychology of the industrial filter. Every single high-value domain across this modern landscape is actively guarded by an automated obstacle matrix designed specifically to weed out the weak, the reactive, and the validation-dependent spectators. If building a multi-million-dollar enterprise or achieving an elite standard of mental strength were a simple matter of reading a few quotes or maintaining a soft daily habit for a weekend, the absolute valuation of that achievement would drop to zero. The resistance you feel when your screen reads 0 impressions, or when your progress tracks hit a hard processing wall, is not a structural glitch in the matrix. It is the fundamental filter doing exactly what it was engineered to do. It is checking your papers at the gate. It is testing the density of your skull to verify whether you are a real producer who can execute commands in absolute darkness, or simply another fragile consumer looking for a quick payout of cheap ego satisfaction. When you step up to the resistance wall and choose to logging the hours, regardless of the metrics, you are passing the filter while your competition breaks down and runs away to return to their vices. Master the structural practice of emotional baseline freezing. When an amateur general receives an unexpected field report stating that his frontline columns have been outmaneuvered or his supply reserves have been entirely compromised. His heart rate instantly spikes, his vision narrows, and he floods his tactical headquarters with an absolute wave of frantic commands. He is reacting from a place of biological survival panic, which means his choices are being dictated by his chemical flaws rather than his intellect. A sovereign commander handles the exact same data cluster by freezing his emotional matrix to absolute zero. He looks at the disaster map not as a personal crisis or an insult from fate, but as a completely neutral tactical arrangement that simply requires a clean, calculated modification of his next movement vector. He does not waste an hour screaming at his captains or mourning the loss of his initial blueprint. He calmly logs the new coordinates on his laboratory floor, resets his variables, updates his strategic tracking line, and deploys his remaining armor units with clinical, silent precision. The ultimate destination of your personal growth journey is to achieve a state of total, untouchable environmental independence. Most individuals operate their routines like a basic thermometer, completely reflective of the immediate temperature of the room around them. If the room is warm, if people are throwing accolades at their name, and if the numbers look high, they feel motivated and disciplined. If the room drops into a cold winter chill, if the crowd falls into a heavy silence, and if their initial efforts return zero visible metrics, their focus instantly collapses into stagnation. They are completely dependent on the weather. You must learn to operate your inner citadel like a heavy industrial thermostat. You do not reflect the temperature of your environment. You dictate it by the internal settings of your own non-negotiable principles. Let the public arena drop into absolute zero. Let the critics turn their cold backs on your empire, and let fate deal its most chaotic hand. Deep inside the silent, dark void of your own mind, your engine must continue to run at peak velocity simply because your internal layout refuses to accept a single second of mediocrity from your hands.